For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, with the latest readout video from our free Wednesday Wake Up email newsletter, to which you should subscribe as you should to this channel, and please also support us in the spirit of brotherly love, like the viewers in Philadelphia, who've made it number 38 on this year's list of views by city. Then, in a very different spirit, we bring you our latest green money machine response to snide claims that we skeptics have all the money.
The Green Money Machine.
It's number 6 this week, and it's the League of Conservation Voters. But we do not repeat ourselves, because back at number 11, it was the League of Conservation Voters Education Fund, earning over $75 million a year. But now it's the full League of Conservation Money, voters, also based in that heartland of political money, Washington, D.C., and good for $158.1 million in 2024. So it's a bit much that even a subdivision of that outfit is rolling in dough. And, of course, they're churning out predictable rhetoric. They want to, quote, build power for people and the planet, end quote. Like it's 1968 out there, man. So, of course, quote, LCV's community-based organizing programs build a locally rooted and racially inclusive grassroots base of power to advocate for climate action and a stronger democracy, end quote. Oh, racially inclusive. You're not segregated. That's nice to know in 2026. But wait, because it's all omni-cause all the time. Quote, from the climate crisis to assaults on our democracy to economic inequality, these challenges are caused and exacerbated by the realities of systemic and structural racism and other interlocking systems of oppression, end quote. And boo Trump and boo corporations. Quote, again and again, the House and Senate slashed environmental protections for and tried to sell off our public lands to fossil fuel companies and other polluting corporations, end quote. Even though they spent over $50 million on political activity in 2024. And no, you don't need to ask where these independent-minded people stand on partisanship. Quote, Democrats' forced votes on affordable clean energy, the environment, support for our federal agencies and workforce, and voting rights, pushing back on Republicans' efforts to hand power to President Trump, end quote. So, please send us $50 or $5 to fight interlocking systems of lucrative error. Then in the newsletter, we note that the European heat wave seems to have subsided somewhat, so the proponents of global warming are rushing to the next local hotspot. Though, as Chris Martz notes, the problem in Europe was an omega block in the jet stream of a sort that seemed to be getting more common there, but not in most of the planet, which is strange if they're a planetary phenomenon. For our part, we continue to maintain that first, since the planet is almost certainly warming naturally as it emerges from the Little Ice Age, warming alone is not irrefutable proof of human influence. And second, that since the urban heat island clearly contaminates the records, we're not sure it's warming as much as those famous graphs seem to show. As one among many pieces seizing on the heat wave said, quote, I was particularly struck that many cities in France and Germany recorded their warmest night ever, end quote. But do they really not know that nights warming faster than days is a key red flag that you've got an urban heat island effect, not a general warming trend? And the third thing we insist on is that EU warming is clearly amplified by the decline in European cloud cover over the last quarter century, which no one has managed to link to CO2, and which therefore somehow doesn't get mentioned in news stories. Meanwhile, to try and stay cool in the midst of all this, we turn on the AC. Because a revealing aspect of this episode, and we'll return to it later in this video, is the curious difference between Europeans and North Americans when it comes to how governments propose to protect the public from the heat that they say is now more common. As Robinson Meyer notes in Heat Map, only about 19% of European homes have air conditioning, whereas nearly 70% of Canadians do, and 91% of homes in Japan. And it's not that Canada or Japan is hotter than Europe, so are we just smarter? Or more compassionate? Then we share with you the news, hat tip to the Free Beacon, that another significant alarmist has gone over to the let's not panic side. It's not quite on the level of Bill Gates, or Al Gore if he ever did so, but Michael Grunwald of the Washington Post is now grumping that, quote, some climate activists have an annoying habit of exaggerating how badly things are going, end quote. arguably once including him, since he did write a book called We Are Eating the Earth, and he wrote another, quote, praising Vice President Joe Biden for his clean energy transition leadership of President Obama's $800 billion in stimulus spending, end quote. Grunwald's not all the way back to sanity. He still says, quote, global warming is making droughts and floods worse, end quote, whereas in fact they're not getting worse, so neither warming nor anything else can be making them worse. But on the other hand, he does say that global warming isn't causing them. So, we also welcome the fact that he says, quote, global warming does not always make everything worse, end quote, and we look forward to the day that he says it actually makes some things better. Speaking of which, a perky item from the San Bernardino Sun offers, quote, 16 free fun things to do in July in Southern California, end quote, because, quote, it's summertime, and that means it's time to get outside and have some fun, end quote. But wait, surely Southern California is a famous hot place ravaged by global heating, swept by wildfires, and who knows what all. Go outside? Are you insane? Or is it the climate fearmongers who've gone mad and summer that stayed nice? Dare to go outside and see, we say. Meanwhile, The Guardian says, climate ate my house. Or, more exactly, climate will eat my house, followed by treating some wild speculation about the future as sober reporting about the present. Quote, as hotter, drier summers driven by global heating become more frequent, the ground under houses can shrink and drag down a property's foundations. The most vulnerable areas include London, Essex, Kent, and a trench of land from Oxford up to the Wash on England's east coast, according to scientists who say mitigation measures will be needed, end quote. So, climate change will cause hot, dry conditions that yank the ground out from under British houses, unless it causes cold, wet conditions which yank the ground out from under British houses, according to... Oh, that was also The Guardian. Meanwhile, Canada's National Post reports that this country is lifting a 2-year ban on the controversial rodenticide called strychnine, quote, following damages worth hundreds of millions by a particular rodent in Alberta and Saskatchewan, end quote. But it took so long for the government to act that farmers won't be able to use it until next year, despite an exodus of businesses from the agricultural sector due to the cumbersome regulatory environment. And it also strikes us that while strychnine might be controversial, it's certainly not new or unfamiliar. It's actually been known since ancient times, though it wasn't chemically analyzed until the 19th century, in time for Agatha Christie to use it repeatedly. In her fiction, we hasten to add, not in her personal life. But when governments tell you that they're cutting edge, wiser, more decisive, faster moving, and more public minded than the dumb, destructive private sector, remind yourself and them of this kind of episode. Or the news that the US FDA just approved the first new sunscreen filter ingredient in 27 years. Yes, folks, moving at the speed of silt. And another thing. As we noted last week, the settled science says that a terrible El Niño is coming, and although it's not climate-related, it is. But then again, Phys.org profiles a geophysical research letter study under the headline, quote, super El Niños may lose their punch in a warming world, end quote. So, some computer models say that a warmer world sees less extreme impacts from the ENSO. Meanwhile, an item in the Silicon Review warns, quote, extreme heat wave drives record global fires. As El Niño looms, scientists warn, end quote. So essentially, the exact opposite, thus covering all the bases. And for good measure, the scientists who warn are, of all people, World Weather Attribution, who claim, quote, record-breaking global fire outbreaks, end quote, are happening in a world in which, actually, wildfires have declined fairly steadily for centuries. In the newsletter, we also note that when the Atlantic Weekly Planet asked via email, quote, why the media keep quoting the same climate scientists, end quote, we had an answer ready. Because he tells them what they want to hear, and he does it in quotable ways. They're talking about the guy who coined hydroclimate whiplash to explain why droughts and floods are both becoming more common, and hence California wildfires are, even though actually none of them are increasing. Also, this guy cusses, which is apparently a virtue, but we won't quote it because we don't think so. Instead, we'll observe that it's part of the decay in thought in the modern world that lazy or engaged journalists, or lazy engaged journalists, quote the same handful of people or person on an issue over and over again. even though there are literally thousands that they might call who have a variety of interesting views. And even worse, it's treated as something to celebrate, not a warning sign about the narrowing of minds and of sensationalism. At which point, we again quote Parker Gallant, who after cataloguing yet more follies in Ontario's convoluted and expensive power system, moves on to a key point about green energy, which is that it's dirty. From those discarded wind turbine blades in Texas to asbestos in turbines in Britain to rooftop solar panel fires, yikes, to the hideous problem of disposing of such panels even if they don't burst into flames, it turns out that, to borrow a line from Voltaire, the green energy transition is neither a transition, energy, nor green. Which doesn't leave much. No, wait, it does. It leaves a giant midden heap of toxic waste, shattered hopes, and misleading hype from activists and politicians. Ugh. In the newsletter, we then continue our look at the book Canary in a Climate World, and this week we examine Chapter 2 by Dr. Patrick Moore, lifelong environmentalist and Greenpeace co-founder. Also Greenpeace outcast, albeit self-imposed, because in his words, quote, scientific reasoning was subordinated to political activism, end quote. He first saw the pattern emerging when the organization that he helped found began a push for a worldwide ban on chlorine, even though chlorination of drinking water is one of the most important public health measures in use around the world today, and in fact one of the most important public health breakthroughs ever. Not to mention that chlorine is half of salt, which means, among other things, that it's ubiquitous in the oceans. Quote, that moment made it clear to me that complex scientific realities were being replaced with moral slogans, end quote, he says. Quote, today the same pattern appears in climate policy, only on a vastly larger scale, end quote. Indeed. Now, in the early 1970s, Patrick Moore, who has a doctorate in ecology, played a key role in stopping the mass slaughter of whales. And he's also in the most iconic seal-hugging picture of all time. So you'd think that his credentials as a committed and informed environmentalist ought to be beyond challenge. And in this chapter, he walks his readers through the essential role that carbon dioxide has played in the evolution of life on this planet. CO2 levels were much higher than today for hundreds of millions of years, during which plant life flourished. But there's a problem here. Living organisms in the sea lock carbon away in geological formations of limestone, chalk, marble, and fossil fuels, which is an important reason why they've been declining for millions and tens of millions of years. As a matter of fact, during the most recent ice age cycles, the glaciations, CO2 levels have fallen to perilously low levels, and they're still way below what's typical of Earth's history. As a matter of fact, Moore says that we ought, if possible, to raise them dramatically. He thinks we should double them, at least. Also, he insists in that chapter, quote, climate has always changed, it will continue to change, end quote. And he points out that temperature and CO2 move together over time, when they move together, partly because oceans release CO2 as they warm and absorb it when they cool. So temperature can easily be driving CO2 change as much as the opposite. And in the context of these complexities, Moore warns that net zero goals underestimate, quote, the importance of affordable energy to human well-being, end quote. So, summing it up, he says, quote, stewardship must be grounded in science rather than fear. There is no climate emergency, and carbon net zero is a ridiculous solution to an imaginary problem, end quote. And summing it up, we say that the key lesson from Moore's chapter is not the specifics, important as they are, but the abandonment of reasoning among so many climate activists of exactly the same sort on warming today that drove him out of Greenpeace decades ago, which suggests that it's an enduring problem. Now, revenons à notre France, which is emerging from a heat wave, or, as we prefer to call it, a hot snap. And many young French people were recently in the United States for the World Cup of soccer or football, depending how you look at it, and they posted on social media that the colonists have this wonderful thing called air conditioning, where if it's too hot outside, you make it cooler inside, just as if it's too cold outside, you make it warmer inside with a furnace. Which may help explain why the French are now demanding it for themselves, to the point that there have been near riots in response to AC units being made available at stores. Despite which, French politicians and the media have condemned the call for air conditioning as far-right and anti-environment, although they conveniently exempted EU President Ursula von der Leyen, whose offices on the top floors of the Commission headquarters were kept pleasantly cool, while the air conditioning on the 7 floors below were ordered to be shut off to save energy. These people don't embarrass easily, do they? Now, the anti-air conditioning logic seems to be that more air conditioning requires more electricity generation, which means more greenhouse gases, which means more climate crisis, which means more heating, which means more air conditioning, and so on. Now, given that the politicians who are pushing this logic are also demanding that everyone switch to electric cars and electric heat pumps, we could simply ridicule the hypocrisy and be done with it. But instead we want to point out something particularly idiotic about France. France generates nearly 70% of its energy from nuclear, with wind and solar bringing the total to 95%. Coal and oil are under 0.3% each, and natural gas is 3%. But that's not the ridiculous thing. The ridiculous thing is that because this is where they get their power, increasing electricity generation to power AC units would cause virtually no additional greenhouse gas emissions. But it would make the lives of French citizens better, and indeed it would prevent thousands of unnecessary deaths during heat waves. Which means that elite opposition to it isn't just sanctimonious, it's deranged. Finally, our friends at co2science.org refer to this particular plant as mile-a-minute vine, but Google says that name is usually given to Persicaria perfluolata, and the one they're talking about, Eponomoia chiricea, is also known as morning glory. It's edible, it's pretty, and it has medicinal properties, though it can be a noxious pest if it takes over. And with more CO2 in the air, we may have to call it 2 miles a minute, because in 2009, an experiment showed that an additional 300 parts per million in the air boosted its growth rate by 61%. For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, and I'm running the AC. Oh yeah.